Great, thanks so much, and welcome all to this foreign affairs discussion marking the release just a couple of days ago of our January-February 2024 issue. We wanted to use this occasion to bring together a few authors who have contributed some of the notable pieces, both to that issue of the magazine and to foreignaffairs.com since October 7th and since the start of the war in Gaza, in the hopes that they can shed some light on how we got here and where we are, but also more importantly, on how we might go forward and how some of the key decision makers in governments and institutions can constructively shape those outcomes. I believe all three of them are fairly well known to most of you joining the discussion today. We have Lisa Anderson. Lisa is a professor of international relations at Columbia University. She was previously the president of the American University of Cairo, as well as dean of Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. And she is, most importantly, the Middle East book reviewer for Foreign Affairs. Next, we have Salam Fayyad. Salam is now a professor at Princeton. He was previously the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority from 2007 to 2012. Before that, he was finance minister, as well as a longtime official at the World Bank and the IMF. And last but not least, Amos Yadlin. Amos is a former general in the Israeli Air Force. He was head of military intelligence in Israel from 2006 to 2011, and then went on to head Tel Aviv University's Institute of National Security Studies, and now runs his own consultancy called Mind Israel. Thanks so much to all three of you for joining me today and for your contributions to foreign affairs in recent months. I want to start by posing versions of the same question to all three of you about the strategy of key actors in both the war now unfolding and the broader conflict of which it's a part. I think the idea here is to try in a way that I think has been strikingly difficult as the war unfolds, to lay out clearly what the objective is, what means each actor is employing to achieve that objective, and what kind of theory of success they have that suggests that the chosen means can get them to the desired end. So, Amos, I'll start with you. We've heard various Israeli figures say that the objective is the destruction of Hamas. You articulated a version of that in your recent essay for the magazine called Why Israel Slept. That has a military dimension, but as with any real war aim, it's a political objective ultimately. What exactly would that look like in practice, and how is the current Israeli approach meant to yield that result? And I'm interested in both your assessment of how the current leadership thinks of that, but also how you would assess it and whether you think it's viable.
Yeah, the 7th of October is a huge trauma for the Israelis, and there is 95% support for the government goals that are three: not to destroy Hamas, not to eliminate Hamas, but to dismantle Hamas. To dismantle Hamas as a governance and to demilitarize Hamas as a military, as an army. The Israelis look at Gaza as a neighboring state that attacked Israel, that killed 900 innocent civilians, kids in front of their parents, parents in front of their children, raped 14 years old girls, and kidnapped many of them. And Israel see it as if this is Nazi Germany attacking a neighboring country. So it should be destroyed, not as a retaliation, but as never again. Never let a Palestinian entity or Palestinian state having a military that can do it again. This is the goal about dismantling Hamas as a government and as a military force. By the way, going back all the way to the Oslo Accord, which spoke about demilitarized Palestinian state or Palestinian entity. So this is the first goal. The second goal is to bring back home those, once again, kids, mothers, elderly, Holocaust survivors, and soldiers and female soldiers that were taken to Gaza. This second objective was not there in the beginning. In the beginning, it was like we lost 1,400 people, another 250, but destroying Hamas is more important. As we speak today, the two objectives are in the same level. In the same level, the Israeli public opinion, listening to the stories of those who came back from Gaza, put this objective of bringing back the hostages in the same level. The third objective is to return those who leave the Western Negev, the kibbutzim, the towns that are now without their residence, because they don't want to live and to be exposed to another attack. So this again going to the first objective, to dismantle Hamas from its military power, but not as an event of one time, but create conditions for a long time that they can come back safely to their places. So this is the objectives. Are they close to achieve the objectives? No, they are not. This is a war against a terror organization that build an army. It is not the regular terror organizations that send explosive cars or suicide bombers. It's a military. And this military have built a huge infrastructure under Gaza Strip. They have 5 brigades and many battalions. And like any weak force, they are not comforting the IDF, they disappear under the ground. And this will take time. I look at the time, I called my friend John Allen, General Allen, who led the coalition against ISIS. And Hamas for us is like ISIS to you. The only problem is that ISIS was not supported by one country from the world. Hamas is supported by many, Turkey, Qatar to be mentioned too. And Israel is fighting not with a coalition of 85 states like John Allen led. We are basically fighting alone with the support of the United States of America, and the people of Israel are really appreciating President Biden moral support, financial support, and military support. So it took 18 months to take back Mosul and Raqqa. And Mosul and Raqqa was not with underground city, were not equipped with the best Iranian weapon, and it was not close to Texas or to Maine. It was far away. And most of the fighters were Iraqis. And there were not 240 American refugees. So the IDF is working slowly. 18 months, Gaza is more complicated. So let's double it. 36 months. Let's say the Israelis are 4 times better than those Iraqis that fought there. So we need 9 months. Do we have 9 months? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. We will discuss it, I guess, later.
Yep.
So this is the goal.
That's a bracing place to start. Salam, let me turn to you. I should stress that neither Mos nor Salam speaks for their respective leadership, so they both have held senior positions in the past. Salam, let me split a version of that question into 2 parts, given the split in Palestinian leadership. What do you see as Hamas's theory of success in the current conflict? Is it working? And second, is the Palestinian Authority playing any active role here? And if so, what is its aim?
Thank you very much, and thanks to you for convening this webinar to Foreign Affairs. It's important. Appreciate very much the opportunity to be with you. First, before I address that directly, brief comment on the objectives as perceived from the Israeli side. The 3 of them dismantle, return hostages, and the return of citizens, Israeli citizens, to border areas from which they were evacuated, not only around Gaza, but also in the north as well. If we were to begin with the last objective, I think it's obviously achievable, but it requires something other than what is going on in the form of war, because to really have that kind of peace and tranquility, whatever security arrangements there are need to be underpinned by political accommodation understandings for that to be sustainable. History tells us that, history of the conflict itself tells us that as well. Return of hostages, some of that happened. Some, of course, is yet to happen. The difficulty I have actually is with the first one, dismantling Hamas. And that's not the way in which that objective was first stated by the government of Israel. It was first projected as a key objective of the war, or Israel's reaction to Hamas's attack on southern Israel on October 7, was to destroy, eradicate. I mean, all of this was used. And even if, that objective was subsequently restated, watered down a little bit in other forms, but to me, regardless of the formulation, the stated objective as it pertains to dismantling, eradicating and all, here in terms of attainability, what we're looking at ranges from the highly unattainable or impossible to the unattainable, highly unattainable to the unattainable. So obviously we all can agree in terms of eradication of Hamas as a political movement with an ideology is out of the question. But the lesser stated objectives actually to me are unattainable. The war has been going on for more than 2 months, and to this day, there's still rockets launched from Gaza into Israel. And all. So what I see personally, actually, and here I begin to pivot more to our side, Palestinian side, what's going on. The way largely Palestinians see it, I mean, it's not really a question of Hamas, PA, whoever. The way I see it, actually, is, this war continuing is doing little more than, actually, and is coming at the very, very high cost of massive casualties among civilian population in the hundreds every day. And if we all can agree that end of the day, regardless of what happens, there will need to be a form of political accommodation to underpin peace, security, stability, and all, the sooner we get to that point, the better, in my judgment. That's what really prompted me to write the piece I wrote for Foreign Affairs from the very beginning. Part of the reason is that we have seen this before. Yes, not to the same scale that is going on right now. What's going on right now is unprecedented by any measure, by any comparison, regional, international, what have you. This is really major. But if we, for example, go back to the escalation, round of escalation of 2014, some of what we heard at the beginning, shortly after October 7, from coming out of Israel, is not that different from what we had coming out of Israel in 2014. Similar objectives and all, but it ended up being every time a case of kicking the can down the road. I fear that this is, what's going on right now. And again, the rhetoric keeps shifting. Sometimes it vacillates from high to low to high again. I mean, it's not like moving in one direction toward de-escalation. Is that end of the day, we really need to find a political solution to this problem. The sooner we really get there, the better. I was hoping that the release of captives would carve out enough diplomatic space for there to be some movement to come to view as to how to really get out of this, including on our side, because it has been my view for many, many years that actually factional rivalries underlie much of our own kind of inability to really get to the point of being able to achieve our stated objectives, regardless of how those objectives are stated or by whom they're stated. Stability is dependent on it. I mean, sustainable stability and peace is also dependent on finding a way in which our pluralism can be more effectively managed. So far, it's not managed, which brings me to your question as to Hamas and Palestinian Authority. Beginning with the latter, first you said in terms of the extent to which it really featured in this. Not different from what we have experienced before, previous rounds of escalation. Palestinian Authority found itself in the immediate aftermath of October 7 as helpless, not able to do anything of consequence, and maybe even not able to say much of anything. That resonated with people, and that so far, I mean, I haven't really checked the news today, but so far remains largely the case. It is logical to expect that, because that's what history also tells us. Whenever that happened before, these kinds of escalations with Israel in and around Gaza, the PA will come under intense political pressure. That was easily predictable. And this time around, it happened when the PA was already very weak, lacking in political viability, legitimacy in the way it's seen by public, not doing very well. And that actually relates to its own performance in the West Bank. So for all the talk about what's going to happen in Gaza in the day after, quote unquote, let's look at the starting point of absolute weakness. Anyone who would say otherwise would not really be looking at the reality as it exists. Now, the war actually added to that pressure, predictably. I mean, it was not very difficult to predict. A lot of us, analytically speaking, were looking at the consequences of this, thinking about possibility of regional escalation, spillover, stability spillover into regional countries, neighboring countries and all. Some of that has happened, not dramatically, etc. One should not really ignore that possibility. But one thing for certain, I personally predicted that the PA would come under severe political pressure, thereby weakening it a lot more, even beyond the very feeble status it really got to before October 7. What was happening in the West Bank up to October 7, that's what everybody was focused on at the time. A lot of analysts were predicting eruption of third intifada based on what was happening. Settler violence, repeated incursions by Israeli army. By the way, there's been an intensification of that after October 7, and that's not really reported on enough. So that's where the PA is, and that's how it has been influenced by it. I heard something that's going to be said about polling and where people stand. Most recent poll taken that I saw, I think it was released 2 days ago, the standing Palestinian Authority with the public is at its lowest ever, predictably, in form of percentage of people taking Gaza and West Bank together who would like to see President Abbas leave. I see this not as a vote of confidence or lack of confidence in the president himself, as much as it is that through him, Palestinians see the Palestinian Authority as a political entity representing them. 88% of people polled in Gaza and West Bank want to see that come to an end. Actually, the West Bank, the percentage is higher, it's 92%. That was not, I mean, it was poor before the war, but it's actually a lot worse. And that is something we really need to also factor in this course. Now, in terms of Hamas, and you know what I'm really saying is, I'm saying analytically and by observing and reading what's going on, I sort of really alluded to, the fact, what I have seen actually as a perennial source of weakness for our national movement historically, not the product of the last 20, 30 years, but actually for many, many decades now, actually, factional rivalries. I mean, this is not something new, and it's been failure to really find the way, not to suppress pluralism, but to actually manage it effectively, given the expectation, given the objectives, all of that, that's contributing to that. Hamas did say at the outset that they did it because of Al-Aqsa Mosque and because of what's happening in the West Bank, the violence, settler violence, terrorism, and all. And all of these grievances are Palestinian grievances, they're not Hamas own grievances, but Hamas is a political movement. And they have managed to align themselves, politically speaking, where they were perceived, majority of Palestinians were on these issues. In the nature of political movements, that's what they do. Question is really, how do you deal with this? And that really has to go into thinking as to how to come to a view about a future that can underpin security once it's achieved. Finally, given all of what I've said, I see it as a priority to really do everything that's possible to bring this war to an end today before tomorrow, before the day after. All I see happening right now, beyond what has happened so far, is more killing, death, and destruction, which is going to really make it even more difficult to really get to the day after and really do the healing and the getting out of this and getting to a better tomorrow for everybody that we all must be really focused on. I could say something about the US, but maybe I'm running out of time here, so I'll stop.
Let me go to Lisa for the U.S. dimension. Lisa, you obviously don't speak for the Biden administration, But what is your assessment of their theory of the case here? Obviously, it's become strained in the last few days as you've seen more of a divergence between Israeli statements and those coming from the administration. But do you see a coherent theory of the case? Do you see that changing in this moment?
I actually think part of the problem for the United States is that there is not a coherent theory of the case, if you will. Keep in mind that ever since the Obama administration, the United States has wanted to pivot away from the region, wanted to think about China, wanted to think about Russia, so forth and so on. So I think part of the difficulty is that this was obviously an intelligence and moral surprise and trauma for Israel. But in some respects, the same can be said for the Biden administration. This was not something they expected, as Jake Sullivan's famous foreign affairs observation that the Middle East hadn't been as peaceful as this in years, published days before October 7th. So I think part of what you were seeing in the Biden administration is surprise and kind of scrambling to figure out what to do. And I think a sort of very personal Biden affinity for Israel, a sense that Israel has long been a solid ally of the United States, and therefore in its time of difficulty needs American support. So weighed in pretty unconditionally in supporting Israel in its response to October 7th. And I think it's therefore a second surprise to find that neither internationally nor domestically is that as clear-cut a position as the administration thought it was. So now, not only are they trying to figure out some longer-term way of thinking about the region as a whole, they would still like it to be something they don't have to worry about, but also now managing being relatively isolated internationally in the support for Israel, as the United Nations, the General Assembly vote suggested. But even this turning into a fairly raucous and uncomfortable debate within the United States, which clearly was not something they anticipated. So at this point, I think you still see an administration that's really grasping at straws to think about how to manage into a situation which obviously everyone thinks would be more desirable, to be thinking about political solutions than military. But in a sense, I really think we're seeing an administration that's not thinking strategically yet.
I want to turn to what Salam referred to as the day after question momentarily, but Amos, let me first go to you very quickly. For your assessment of the meaning of the significance of the global outcry over civilian casualties in Gaza, especially, and the increasing signs of some tension between Washington and the Israeli leadership, do you see that as a strategic problem for the Israeli offensive? You talked about the amount of time needed. I think the world is kind of increasingly expecting something much quicker. Is that a strategic liability at this point? Unless you're muted still.
Yeah, no doubt that there is different views in Jerusalem and in Washington about the way of achieving a common goal. And it is a common goal to dismantle Hamas, to destroy Hamas, to eradicate Hamas, whatever term you choose. I choose dismantle. But they use the same phrase. Why they use the same phrase? Because this is go against the American interest in the Middle East. Whoever want two-state solution don't want to see Hamas there. Hamas is against two-state solution. Hamas is not recognizing the Oslo Accord. Hamas is not denouncing terror. Hamas is not recognizing Israel. So anybody who is a combination of jihadist Islamic ISIS and Iranian supported will never, ever bring a two-state solution. So this is why the US support it, and it's also a derail normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which was so important to the Biden administration. So we are sharing the same goal. However, the Americans, the Biden administration, want us to do it quickly, without collateral damage, and without humanitarian crisis. I don't know if the US have ever done it this way. I already spoke about 18 months campaign against ISIS. I will not mention 20 years in Afghanistan. I will not mention 7, 8 years in Iraq. And once again, I will not mention Dresden or Tokyo. Okay? You cannot destroy an enemy that is willing to use his own citizens as human shield. And this is exactly what Sinwar is doing. There are buildings in Israel asked all of them to remove themselves from Hamas target. Hamas haven't let them do it. Hamas built all their installations, command posts, intelligence posts, producing rockets under hospitals, under UNRWA schools, under UN position, and under everything that they know that Israel will not attack from the air. And that's why Israel has to get there through a ground maneuver. So we're coming to a point that because of the international criticism, and I'm not impressed from the UN General Assembly voting against Israel, because Abba Eban used to say that even if there will be a resolution that the earth is flat, the UN and Israel is to be blamed about it, the UN General Assembly will vote for it. The ceasefire can be achieved tonight, if Sinwar will bring back the hostages, put them on the pickups and send them to Egypt. This can bring a ceasefire. If you want to blame somebody that there is no ceasefire, it's Sinwar and not anybody else. So the war will continue until Sinwar will be destroyed and his organization will be destroyed. And if the President of the United States will decide that continuing with this war is against the interest of the United States and he wants Hamas to survive, I guess he have leverages to stop Israel.
Salam.
I want only to say thank you for Salam Fayyad, who mentioned that Gaza is not the only front that Israel is fighting. We are fighting in 7 fronts. Gaza, high-intensity front. Hezbollah attacked us in the same day, started another front, low-intensity war. We are attacked from Syria, not by Assad regime, who is deterred, by the Palestinians from Syria and some Iranian proxies from Iraq. We have Iran and we have Yemen, and the West Bank is busy because we are now arresting Hamas operative in the West Bank, that what happened in Gaza will not happen in the West Bank. So 7 fronts, and yes, we have to bring back the people to the Upper Galilee as well.
Salam, let me go to you. Feel free to respond to anything Lisa or Amos has said, but I'd also I think it'd be useful to get your kind of the 1-minute version of your proposal for the day after. And I think you first wrote that in Foreign Affairs about 6 weeks ago. The extent to which you see that becoming more or less likely given the events in the 6 weeks since you wrote it.
I'll do it in half a minute, and I'll use the other half to maybe respond and comment on what Amos Yadlin has said about the objectives of war and his assessment that it would need to take 18 months or so to get to the objective, achieve objective of dismantling Hamas. Let me say, if the objective that binds all of us is peace with stability, stability that's underpinned by peace, question is how to achieve it. I personally believe that the objective of dismantling Hamas is not attainable, however many months this is going to really take. Hamas has features of that combine both being a non-state actor with being a state actor. If Hamas were completely not a hybrid, a state actor, you could think of a scenario like in other wars. What brings the war to an end? Total destruction of the country. It brings country to surrender. Well, if you have a non-state features as part of who you are, your identity, it changes. Things change dramatically. I heard Hamas being likened to Daesh, ISIS, and all of that, and I think that really this really is a generalization that we can talk about this extensively. But let me just point to one thing that, as a matter of fact, is extremely relevant in the way the situation in Gaza is looked at. Hamas, unlike Daesh, for example, this is one way in which Hamas is not Daesh. There are many other ways, actually. I mean, we can talk about it, but for the purposes there, unlike Daesh, which actually is a combination of fighters coming from all over the world, descending upon an area and establishing presence and beginning to use it for terror and all of that, Hamas is an integral component of the Palestinian fabric of the society there. So you could conceivably find the family where you have somebody who is Hamas, somebody who has different affiliation, somebody who has nothing to do with factions, with guns, with anything. So the idea that, I mean, again, this caricature of Hamas kind of acting the way it is, using civilians as human shields and all, human shields that we're really talking about are their own families. So I think we really need to think about that a little bit. But more to the point of how much longer can this or should this be allowed to continue before the objective of dismantling Hamas is achieved. At the current rate, just doing a simple extrapolation, and I hate to do this with human lives, we're looking at basically 200,000 Palestinians perishing. So, Amos Yadlin said something about collateral damage. And when was it that any other country was asked, time of war, what did you do, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just be clear on what another 20 months of this hell is going to mean. It's going to mean 200,000 Palestinians killed at the current rate that's going on right now. Is this just simply collateral damage that can be dismissed, knowing, at least as far as I'm concerned, that the objective, as stated, is not attainable to begin with? Might as well begin today. On hostages, he also mentioned that Sinwar could end the war tomorrow if he were to put the hostages on a truck, send them to Egypt or Israel or something like that. And he also mentioned the United Nations. The United Nations had before it the Security Council a draft resolution. Everybody kind of looked at ceasefire component of it without really looking at what else it contained. That resolution actually did not talk about permanent ceasefire, first of all. It talked about humanitarian ceasefire. But beyond that, it called for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. That's the language in the resolution. And yet, that resolution was not allowed to pass. So, unfortunately, that was actually missed. It's important to really try to look and find ways. As part, and here I come to your question, as part of really helping towards bringing the war to an end, my idea about what to do and how to really manage it in the day after, and I hope this comes sooner rather than later, as I'm sure we all can agree, is for us Palestinians to move. And you asked me about what the Palestinian Authority has done or did not do. That was not a question about what it should do. What the leadership should do is to actually immediately, convene a meeting for all the secretaries general of all Palestinian factions and put them all around the table. And this is how you lead. You have all, points of view represented, and this body is going to lead, the Palestinian people, and transitionally is going to govern through a reconstituted, reconfigured PA, one that is product of consensus, a government that is consented to by this committee of the whole, so to speak. And that is going to, a government formed this way with consent of everybody can be available to go to Gaza immediately without the stigma of it being seen as coming to Gaza on top of an Israeli tank or something like that. Why? Because it's product of consensus. That's not hard to achieve, which finally brings me to the point about this discord about Oslo and all. And John Yadlin also mentioned something about demilitarized state. There was no state in Oslo. Let's just be clear. Part of what really needs to happen is actually to revisit that whole framework and see what needs to happen to underpin a transitional period of total quiet that is bookended by elections on the Palestinian side, that's for sure. I don't know what's going to happen in Israel. But for that to really actually be underpinned by resurrection of some hope about possibility for us to at some point get to the point where we're able to live as free people with dignity and country of our own. That requires different kind of process, one that clearly states as an outcome the emergence of an independent Palestinian state on the territory occupied in 1967, as opposed to the original Oslo, which had none of that. It was presumed, it was subject matter of conversation for sure, subsequently, but not in the agreement itself.
Lisa, let me go to you with a two-part question. First, you've seen various proposals for governance of Gaza in the wake of this, whenever that comes. A lot of those include some role for regional governments, including Egypt, which you've written about for Foreign Affairs, as well as Saudi and Qatar and the UAE and others. Do you see any willingness, any prospect on the part of those governments that they would actually take part in that? And then second, as you look forward, do you see, Amos had mentioned the normalization discussions between Saudi and Israel following on some of the other normalization deals in recent years. Do you see any prospect of a return to that? Will that still be a kind of major regional dynamic, or has this really put an end to that for the time being?
Well, first, let me just remind everyone that the American experience in Afghanistan and even with ISIS was not, in fact, a success. And so the idea that you can spend 20 years trying to destroy a social movement and obviously leave the country, the social movement, that is to say the Taliban political movement, reappears. So how we understand the sort of historical examples, I think we should be careful with. ISIS may not be operating in Iraq, but certainly operating all over the Sahara. So these are very hard to address militarily, and I think that's part of what this debate is about. As far as the regional investment in the future of Gaza, I think, again, keep in mind that most of these governments are thinking not only about any kind of popular view of what they should be doing, but their own stability and longevity. And at this point, certainly, there is absolutely no incentive for any government in the region to step up and say, we're going to help what would seem like bail out the Israelis. So everybody's going to sit on the sidelines for the foreseeable future. There's just no incentive to do that. The Egyptian government, I think, is so far threading the needle by saying, on the one hand, permitting pro-Palestinian demonstrations and so forth, which they don't ordinarily permit, and yet at the same time saying that there is an absolute building a wall so that no Palestinians can be, as we say, pushed into the Sinai. I think there's a lot of popular sentiment that's sympathetic to the humanitarian challenges of living in Gaza right now, in Egypt, for example. So I think the building the wall is a principled, if you will, pro-Palestinian position, but it's not that popular a pro-Palestinian position right now, because these are people who are seeing themselves mirrored in this kind of oppressive and violent environment. So I think for the Egyptian government, they're in a somewhat difficult position, but I wrote in that piece that I thought all of these governments will see opportunities to secure what I call crisis rents, and the Egyptians are already being offered more money from the World Bank and the IMF and so forth and so on. So I think they're seeing, how do they, as a regime, as opposed to a country, benefit from this, and all of the governments will do that. But I don't think they have any interest at all in that, even entertaining imaginary hypothetical regimes for Gaza. That may come later, but at this point, no. And as far as the Saudi-Israel arrangement, I think that's pretty backburnered at this point. Again, the Saudis have no incentive to pursue this at this juncture, and some incentives not to. So they'll just, again, sit on the sidelines, see what develops, see what might be in their interest at some point. But there's nothing there's no reason for them to offer anything. And that will be true, I think, pretty much until there is a pause in the military operations.
Before we go to questions from others who've joined, Amos and Salam, I want to go to each of you just for 1 minute, let's say, on whether a return to some kind of peace process is possible, or kind of political, horizon for the Palestinians, as it's often said, in the wake of this. Whether you think that's at all feasible and what it would take to get there. I suppose in Amos's case, that would mean change in the prime minister's office in Israel, among other things. But very, very quickly, Amos, do you see any prospect of that in the wake of this?
It was very difficult before, and it is almost impossible now. As long as Hamas is there, and if you haven't saw, look at the Khalil Shkakil last poll. The Palestinians support this, the 7th of October, and Israelis are paying attention. And the fact that the Palestinian Authority is corrupt, weak, and the Palestinian people are not supporting it. Last election were 2006, and those who don't remember, Hamas won. So this is on the Palestinian side, and on the Israeli side, the Prime Minister is government survival depends on two radical, extreme right-wing parties that even to say Palestinian Authority is out of a question. And if you look to the long run, generation ahead, I think, and I was always thinking, that the two-state solution is the solution. However, the gaps today between the two people, between the two leadership, cannot be bridged. So the process can be renewed if Hamas will not be there. Reaching a solution, we need a different education in the Palestinian Authority, that people will look into peace and stability, and I fully agree with Salam. This is what we have to get, and not to the terrorists that want to kill the Israelis and to remove them from the river to the sea into the Mediterranean. And this is the majority of the Palestinian people, unfortunately.
Salam, any prospect you see?
Let me say that actually, in terms of the objective, the ultimate objective of attaining peace, I mean, there's no disagreement. I mean, to think that that's around the corner now in the immediate aftermath, I unfortunately can't even say aftermath, because the horror is still going on. After October 7th is a stretch. Not that there was a solution around the corner before October 7th. Part of the reason why we continue to go into this cycle, actually, and again, this is just like the latest, in what could be repeated, by the way. Unfortunately, if history tells us anything, look at the previous rounds of escalations from 2006 onward. It's getting more difficult, up to where we are now. We definitely need a process that is credible, that people look at and say, oh, okay, yeah, it's not going to happen tomorrow that we're really going to really get where we're going, but we are on track that looks to be credible compared to everything that we have seen before. That's the kind of thing that I really am talking about. And the effort here, I'm the first one. I mean, I always was an advocate of looking into the mirror and asking questions, what is it that we Palestinians need to do to assume full agency in our own liberation? That was always my position. It remains so. At the same time, look at the government in Israel. Amos is absolutely right. Some elements sitting on the current government in Israel are opposed not only to the idea of Palestinian state, but even to the existence of this very feeble Palestinian Authority as it is. So a lot has to happen. My idea is to really, how do we make out to exist something that is stronger, more representative, more legitimate, more viable, to be an instrument of A, bringing the war to an end, and B, if supported by a process that is credible with international backing and support, can actually change the reality and the trajectory of the disaster we are on right now. Finally, on money and reconstruction and all. I agree with what you said. The task is just like enormous. Money is an issue. I mean, not no one. I know that for sure, but it's not the issue, to be honest with you. unless there's something that really gives potential donors confidence that they're not really putting in their money only to see whatever it is that's done with the money destroyed or something else happening. That's not going to happen. So I think we should be seized first on political accommodation. What do we really need to do in order to put together a polity that actually can inspire confidence? And then the technical stuff comes in. So what I mean when I say reconstituted, reconfigured, I mean re-enabled, enablement of the PA politically. That's what's really required. And that can happen very quickly, by the way. That can happen very quickly if there is the will. I hope that can happen.
Carrie, let's go to some questions. Let me just ask people who are asking their questions live to make them very, very crisp.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, to ask a question, please click the raise hand icon on your Zoom window. When you're called on, accept the unmute now button. Proceed with your name, affiliation, and question. You may also type your question in using the Q&A box on your Zoom window at any time. A reminder that this meeting is on the record. We'll take our first question from Craig Charney.
Hello, Craig Charney of Charney Research, and hello, Salam, good to see you again. I understand why Israel wants to eradicate Hamas. I don't understand how. Hamas is four things. It's a military organization, and there'll be thousands of fighters left over even after a defeat. It's a political organization. What will happen to the thousands of people below the Politburo level? It's an administration. There are thousands of people who deliver services like health, education, security. What's going to happen to them? And finally, it's an idea of resistance in Islam, which is even more popular than before. So given all that, it looks to me like even in a Hamas military defeat, there'll be the elements either for a powerful insurgency or for a snapback within the administration itself. Am I wrong?
Amos, do you want to quickly take that in?
Yes, I think, thank you for that question. You absolutely analyzed it right. Hamas is a political idea. Hamas is an administration. Hamas is a military and political leadership. And we are not going to deal with the idea. The idea of Hamas, the heart and mind, is up to them. It's up to the Palestinian people. We are going to dismantle their administrative capability to govern Gaza and their militaries. We are not dealing with their intentions anymore. We are dealing with their capabilities. Their capabilities will go close to zero, their military capabilities. So nobody asked when he went to destroy Nazi Germany, what will happen to the Nazi administration? What will happen to the Wehrmacht? Both of them will be destroyed. And if Germans are still believe in a Nazi theory, fine. What have brought Germany to be again a normal democratic nation was years of education, but first really destroying the capabilities of the Nazis to do wrong. And this is what we're going to do with Hamas.
Lisa, Salam, anything you would quickly add?
As a matter of fact, there is in our own history what can provide some insight into what could happen in the day after, again, a different kind of context where there is a process that people can really buy into. The PLO itself today, or the PLO in 1993, as a matter of fact, we started dealing with it before, but really after also 1993. PLO before that was what Hamas is today to Israel. Let's just remember that, I mean, as a matter of fact. And the people who really actually formed the backbone of the security services of Palestinian Authority were PLO fighters throughout, here and there and everywhere. Some came back in the context of the agreement and ended up actually forming, again, the backbone of security services of Palestinian Authority. So there are all kinds of things that need to happen. Once we really move away from the idea of you need to really dismantle and kill off everybody and get it your way militarily, because it's impossible. Again, it's not attainable. That's not going to happen. What victory is to a political movement like this, a non-state actor, I insist, is that thereafter, even if Gaza is leveled completely, which is not really very far from where it is today, a 7-year-old, just like with a visa and just like this, basically, there you go. People's support for the idea of resistance today is higher than it was before all of this happened. So you need to deal with that, and that is something that requires political resolution. I'm not really saying with security being shoved aside, with it being not important. It has to really be central to what we think, if we're really serious about anything. But to really look for a military solution to what is fundamentally a political problem is not really the right policy, given the nature of the task, given the nature of what we're really talking about. Germany was a country that really was, it had an empire at the time, but it was a country. You can defeat a country. It happened time and again. But I'm at a loss understanding how it is that a non-state actor can be definitively defeated. Lisa is absolutely right about ISIS. People are assuming it's been dealt with. Far from it, I don't think so. I hope, that is the case. I hope we never will see the terror, Daesh was continue, resume it anyway. But the reality is you really need to find solutions.
Lisa, you would add?
Daniel, I have to respond because Hamastan is a state. It's a state. There is a government there. There is all the state administration. There is a military there, and it's very much like the Islamic Caliphate in Iraq and Syria. What they have done there, they created a state with bureaucracy, with raising tax, with having a military. And we are now referring to Hamastan in Gaza as a state. We are not going to kill 200,000 Palestinians. This is propaganda. We ask them to leave to the south. When we are now operating in the south, we're doing it much more carefully. And we are doing everything according to the international law. And I think that speaking about letting a terror organization to live under a legitimate government is what Hezbollah is doing. That's what Salam Fayyad wants the Palestinian Authority to do. If it really continue like this, with military under cover of a legitimate government, we are not going to allow it. It's enough in Lebanon, and we will not allow it in a Palestinian state.
Lisa, anything you would add to any of that?
No, I do think that, again, ISIS behaved like a state, but it wasn't a state, and it did bleed out once it was defeated in Iraq and Syria into other parts of the world, and it continues to operate. And the fact that it doesn't continue to operate in places that are central to the Middle East doesn't mean that it doesn't continue to exist. I do think, and perhaps Amos could help us with this a little bit, the difference in the various cases that he refers to of, say, Afghanistan or ISIS or Germany, the Germans surrendered. There was an official, that was it, they surrendered. And in that sense, as Salam is saying, that's a state surrender. Do the Israelis anticipate a surrender? Are they waiting for that? Because that would be an indication that they had defeated an enemy who was acknowledging being defeated. In the absence of that, I think it's very hard to say that we actually will know that the mission has been accomplished. And obviously for Americans, saying mission accomplished is already a sensitive issue.
Let me, Carrie.
Just very briefly, I agree with what Lisa just said, for sure, on this. I mean, I didn't say Hamas was completely a non-state actor. It does, as Amos said, have kind of features, I said, hybrid. But if it were a state, by now it would have surrendered, given all else that has happened in Gaza, the total and utter destruction of infrastructure, no water, no electricity. It would have surrendered if it were a state, but it is not. At least in part it's not.
Carrie, let's take 2 questions in a row, and then we'll go to each panelist for responses to those and any closing thoughts.
We'll take a written question from Anthony, who asks, How does instability on Israel's northern border and conflict with Lebanese Hezbollah complicate the achievement of Israeli war aims and post-conflict governance? And what is the solution? And we'll take one more question live from Larry Garber. Mr. Garber, please go ahead and accept the unmute now button. Apologies, Dan, we'll just turn it back to you.
I'll pass you.
Okay. Lisa, let me let you start on northern escalation or any there's obviously a lot to respond to on the table here, so feel free to go beyond that.
Well, once again, I think, your initial question to us of sort of what is the strategic vision of any of these players, I think, speaking for myself, I haven't seen as much ambiguity and uncertainty about that in the region as a whole in decades and decades. So, that does raise the question of whether there will be any interest among anyone in the region in escalating regionally. Is that something that could possibly be of interest to Iran as a backer of Hezbollah, as a way of needling the United States and making life more complicated for the United States, wholly apart from Israel and Lebanon? So I actually think it's very hard to tell what the interests of various players would be. Would Hezbollah try and be, a diversion from Gaza on its own? Would it only do that with Iranian authorization? Who knows? So I think it's an interesting question, but I don't think it has a very clear answer at this point. Just as it's not clear how anyone will be incentivized in the region to help reconstruct anything in Gaza. It's just it's an interesting moment, but it's very ambiguous.
Amos, let me go to you on the escalation question. Anything else? I think it's kind of particularly front of mind for people whether Israeli leadership will see the need to go after Hezbollah and kind of materially change Hezbollah's capabilities, just given the evacuation of people from the northern border as well.
Yes, intelligence assessment, especially on intentions of terror organizations or leader at all, now has a very low credibility. But I'm still risking to say that Nasrallah doesn't want a full-scale war, and so is the Iranians. President Biden helped them to decide by the two don't, but there was another don't for Israel. Don't escalate. The US is busy in the great power competition with China. They are supporting Ukraine against Russia, and another war in the Middle East after Afghanistan and Iraq is the least desirable goal for any American administration. So what happened in the north, that Hezbollah decided to support Sinwar on the minimum needed symbolic attack. And they attacked Israel. But they restricted their attack to 0 to 5 kilometers, about 5 anti-tank missiles a day, 10, 20 rockets, half of them from Palestinians in Lebanon, and 2 or 3 Palestinian terror teams that were killed on the border. But this basically caused the leaving of 60,000 Israelis on the northern border. And Israel cannot go back to the 6th of October situation in the north. Thanks God, Hezbollah is violating 1701 UN Security Council resolution that they cannot be south of the Litani River, and they were on the border. In a way, they are very frustrated that Hamas stole their surprise attack. They plan to do it with 5,000 terrorists of the Radwan force. And it was done in the end by 3,000 Nukhba terrorists. So Nasrallah is exchange fire with Israel, and Israel is exchange fire with Nasrallah on the lowest level. Escalation can happen first by mistake of one of the sides that will cause casualties that will bring the ladder of escalation up. But the problem is how to remove Hezbollah from the border. We will try to do it diplomatically, but as Theodore Roosevelt have said in 1909, you need a big stick in the air if you want to succeed in diplomacy. And Israel will have to look at it because we are not going back to the 6th of October when Hezbollah is on the board.
Salam, let me go to you to close. You're welcome to address the regional escalation question, but also I think it's worth saying something about the West Bank here.
Regional escalation, I viewed it like many as low probability in terms of really big time escalation. However, I always considered it, and still do, to be, yes, low probability, but if it were to happen, it could be devastating. So it certainly cannot be ignored. The fact that, the analysis has so far turned out to be right in terms of the escalation not having been large scale and all, should not really get us to really be too sanguine about that not happening. And we really haven't said anything about Yemen and what's happening in the Red Sea and all. Not only by mistake, but by calculation, maybe something large scale could happen, regardless of the calculus that really goes into this. Iran was mentioned. I don't think there is really time to get into this, but sooner or later, I think the whole region really needs to be looked at through the prism of what is possible to achieve by bringing in elements of creative diplomacy to really get to the point of regional order, some accommodation that can underpin stability once that is really attained, because minus that, we're going to really continue to go into cycle after cycle of violence and wars that definitely bring nothing but disaster to people in the region.
I wish we had much more time. Lisa, Salam, Amos, thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for the work you've done for Foreign Affairs in recent months, and thanks to everyone for joining. We will certainly continue this conversation in the magazine, and I hope in conversation in the coming months.